Okay, so anyone who spent any time in philosophy knows how much we love our conceptual frameworks, right? And well, today we're going deep into the aesthetic theories of Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Yes, and we're drawing specifically on notes from his lectures on aesthetics from 1938. And I do want to stress here, these aren't like his polished essays. They're more glimpses, really, into his thought process shared in a very specific context with students.
Yeah, for sure. It's like peeking behind the curtain a bit. And for us, exploring this material, it's really important to remember that we're drawing on a whole range of sources. We've got those lecture notes, but we've also got G.E. Moore's records of Wittgenstein's earlier
Oh,
lectures.
yes, from the early 30s. And of course, we can't forget those sort of flashes of insight that just pop up throughout his major works, too. You know, like little gems hidden throughout Culture and Value, philosophical investigations. Even in those later works, like Remarks on the Philosophy, Psychology, and Uncertainty, it's like he just couldn't help but think about these issues.
Exactly. So for you, dear listener, joining us on this deep dive, well, our goal is to first to really grasp Wittgenstein's unique perspective on aesthetics. And that means we need to figure out how it all fits together, how it's interwoven with his big ideas about language, about the nature of the mind, and how meaning actually works.
Yes, and crucially, we want to understand why he goes in such a radically different direction from most traditional aesthetic theories.
Hmm.
You know, all those pronouncements about the absolute essential nature of beauty, or those attempts to try and analyze art through some kind of purely scientific lens. You know, like it's just a matter of collecting data and running experiments.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like he wants to shake things up and say, hey, you're looking in the wrong place entirely. And I think that's where that famously enigmatic opening statement of his comes in, right? Aesthetics, he says, is very big and entirely misunderstood. So what is he getting at there?
Right. Such a provocative way to start. Well, let's maybe begin by unpacking that first part. What does he even mean by very big? What is the scope, the range of this thing called aesthetics?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it sounds almost like, he's making aesthetics out to be this huge, almost intimidating field.
Right. He's not wrong. And I think he's getting at a couple of crucial points. Firstly, he's pushing back against this idea that aesthetics is some neatly defined little corner of philosophy. You know, like it's just over there in its own little box. Instead, he's saying it's deeply connected to really all the most fundamental questions across the entire discipline. Think about it. Our understanding of meaning itself, how perception works, even what we mean by coherence, all of these have some kind of aesthetic dimension to them.
So it's not just about like pointing at a painting and saying, oh, that's beautiful. It's something much more fundamental than that. It sort of bleeds into everything.
Exactly. And the second part of very big is, I think, about just how pervasive the aesthetic is in being human, really, in experiencing the world. It's way bigger than, art with a capital A, the kind of stuff you find in museums and galleries. I mean, we constantly encounter things that have aesthetic interest, the design of everyday objects, the way people move, the patterns in nature. It's a basic part of how we engage with our surroundings.
So it's like the world is constantly offering us these aesthetic encounters, whether we realize it or not. Okay, but then there's that second part of his statement, entirely misunderstood. That sounds like where the real challenge to traditional ways of thinking comes in.
Oh, absolutely. This is where Wittgenstein really sharpens his critical edge. He's arguing that we completely misunderstand aesthetic questions because we try to treat them like empirical problems, as if you could, run a bunch of experiments and somehow discover the objective scientific truth about beauty or artistic value.
So it's like we're approaching it with the wrong tools. We're
Yeah,
trying to use a microscope when we really need something else entirely.
precisely. And he's also taking aim at that long philosophical tradition of trying to find essential definitions, trying to pin down the one thing that all beautiful things share, or what makes something truly a work of art. He thinks that whole project is just completely misguided.
So like centuries of philosophers trying to define beauty, Wittgenstein's just like, nope, you're barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, pretty much. And a lot of this has to do with his evolving views on language, too. He became really suspicious of how the surface grammar of our language can actually mislead us. Take a word like beautiful, for example. We see that word, and almost automatically we assume there must be some like inherent property, something out there in the world that it names.
It's like the grammar itself pushes us to look for this corresponding entity. Like there's a word, there must be a thing it refers to.
Right. It's so insidious. Wittgenstein actually imagined writing this philosophical grammar book Not a grammar book in the traditional sense, telling you how to use commas and stuff, but a book that would really carefully examine all the subtle ways we use words, particularly those words that tend to trip us up philosophically. Words like seeing, feeling, but also those little seemingly harmless words like all and any. He thought if we really paid attention to the nuances of how we use these words, we'd start to see through a lot of the philosophical confusion they generate.
And that seems to connect really strongly to his later idea of language as a toolbox, right? Like in the philosophical investigations, different tools for different jobs.
Absolutely, a direct connection there. He's saying that words don't just have one single function. They're not just labels for things. Instead, they can be used in all sorts of different ways. Like, a hammer is good for pounding nails, but a saw is for cutting wood. So when we fixate on a word like beauty and try to pin down the one thing it supposedly names, we miss the whole range of ways that we actually use aesthetic language in our lives.
So it's not like the meaning is just contained within the word itself, like it's some little container.
Right. Wittgenstein would say the meaning comes from how we actually use it, how it functions within specific situations. He even said that the word itself occupies a negligible place compared to the whole context in which it's used.
It's almost like the word is just a tiny tip of a huge iceberg.
That's a great way to put it. And he thought that this focus on the form of words rather than their actual use was a major flaw in a lot of philosophy, especially in aesthetics.
Okay, so moving beyond individual words, how does this apply to our understanding of a whole work of art?
Well, Wittgenstein would say that to really understand a work, you need to consider it in relation to all sorts of things. Its connection to the artist's other works, the cultural context it was created in, what he called the language game of the period. It's not just an isolated object to be analyzed in a vacuum.
So, like, a painting from Renaissance Italy is going to have a whole different set of rules and meanings than, say, a modern sculpture.
Exactly. And critically, he thinks aesthetic inquiry should start by looking at what he calls the activities of aesthetic life. In other words, what we actually do, how we engage with art, rather than trying to dissect some abstract properties that are supposedly named by aesthetic adjectives.
So instead of endlessly debating what beauty is, we should be studying how people create art, how they experience it, how they talk about it.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole context, the whole lived experience. And he also points out that the very way we use language in art criticism often reinforces this mistaken property with name model. We say things like, this painting is beautiful, or that piece of music is sad, as if these adjectives are just labeling some pre-existing qualities in the work itself.
Yeah, like we're just sticking labels on things.
Right. But Wittgenstein wants us to pay attention to the way we talk about art in other ways. Like when a music critic talks about the rightness of a transition between musical phrases, or a poetry critic talks about how apt a particular image is. In these cases, they're not just slapping on an adjective, they're making a judgment about how the elements of the work fit together.
So it's more about relationships than about, like, essential properties.
Exactly. And he even suggests that a lot of the time, these aesthetic descriptions are more like giving the work a face. Like when we say a piece of music is stately or pompous or melancholy, it's almost like we're imbuing it with a personality.
It's like we're personifying it in a way.
Right. And he even talks about how sometimes gestures can be just as effective as words in conveying aesthetic judgments. Like, you could try to explain the rhythm of a poem with words, or you could just tap it out with your hand. Or think about how a tailor might show his approval of a well-made suit, not by saying, oh, this is well-made, but simply by putting it on and looking pleased.
So actions speak louder than words, even in aesthetics.
Absolutely. And this leads him to think about the role of rules in art and aesthetic judgment. How we learn rules in things like harmony and counterpoint, and how we use words like correct when talking about artistic choices. He's interested in how understanding the rules not only gives you technical skill, but also allows you to really interpret the rules and make finer and finer judgments.
So the rules aren't just constraints. They actually allow for more nuanced understanding and appreciation.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially for philosophers who think about, rule following and how it works. Because Wittgenstein points out that these rules in art, quote, may be extremely explicit and taught, or not formulated at all. In other words, sometimes we learn rules very consciously and deliberately, and sometimes we just sort of pick them up implicitly through practice and exposure.
So, like, a composer might spend years studying harmony and counterpoint, but a child might just naturally develop a sense of rhythm through singing and dancing.
Exactly. And this touches on, Kant's distinction between acting according to a rule and acting from a rule. Like, do you really understand the rule if you can't articulate it? And it also connects to all those debates about rule following in the philosophy of language. Like, how do we ever really know how to apply a rule in a new situation? And even to those discussions about non-cognitivism in ethics and aesthetics, the idea that some judgments, like our moral judgments or aesthetic judgments, aren't really assertions of fact, but more like expressions of our attitudes or feelings.
So when I say this painting is beautiful, I might not be stating a fact about the painting, but rather expressing my own, like, subjective response to it.
That's one way to read it, yeah.
Yeah.
And Wittgenstein goes on to say that, aesthetic appreciation isn't really shown just by what we say, but by what we actually do, like our choices, our actions. So to really understand someone's aesthetic appreciation, you'd have to describe their whole environment, their whole way of interacting with art.
So it's like, going back to that Taylor example, the real proof of appreciation is not saying nice things about the suit, but actually choosing to wear it.
Precisely. And he makes this interesting comparison between aesthetics and ethics. Judging that someone behaves well is a different kind of judgment than saying someone made a profound impression. The whole game, as he puts it, is different. And this all points to the fact that our aesthetic engagements are incredibly complex and situated within a whole web of factors.
So it's not just about individual objects or isolated experiences, it's all interconnected.
Absolutely. And Wittgenstein was constantly reminding us of this complexity. He was really attuned to how our aesthetic judgments are shaped by language, by culture, and by the specific actions we take in the world. He stresses that there's this fundamental connection between our aesthetic expressions and what we call the culture of the period. You can't really understand the meaning of aesthetic words or what cultured taste even is without understanding the whole culture that those things are embedded in.
So, like, our aesthetic vocabulary isn't just some abstract set of terms, it's deeply rooted in our shared way of life.
Exactly. He even says what belongs to a language game is a whole culture. So to fully describe the rules of aesthetic judgment in a particular context, you'd have to describe the whole culture of that time and place. Imagine, he says, the difference between, aesthetic judgments in fin de siècle of Vienna and those of the medieval period. An entirely different game is played in different ages, he says.
So even a simple statement like, I appreciate the style of art, doesn't really mean much unless you understand the whole context in which that style developed and was valued.
Right. The word appreciates isn't some free-floating mental state. Its meaning is tied to its specific use. And if we try to extract some universal essence of aesthetic engagement just by focusing on the word appreciation, we end up in a real bind. We don't have a fixed meaning for the term outside of its actual use, and we also miss the immensely complicated family of cases that actually make up our aesthetic experiences. We try to force kind of neatness on something that's inherently messy and complex.
So we lose all the richness and diversity of our actual experiences in the pursuit of some single, all-encompassing definition.
Exactly, and that's why he says, in order to get clear about aesthetic words, you have to describe ways of living. It's not about making pronouncements like, this is beautiful, but about understanding how these words actually function, almost like gestures within a whole tapestry of human activity.
So it's less about abstract definitions and more about understanding how things actually work in practice. Okay, so we've seen how Wittgenstein critiques traditional aesthetics for its essentialism, its tendency to ignore context. But he was also pretty skeptical about the idea of applying scientific methods to aesthetics. He didn't seem to think much of a science of aesthetics, did he?
No, not at all. He famously said that the idea of a science of aesthetics was almost too ridiculous for words. But, as always with Wittgenstein, his dismissal wasn't just out of hand. He was really interested in understanding why someone would even think that such a thing was possible or desirable. And he digs into those underlying assumptions about causation that often drive this desire for a scientific explanation of art.
So, like, that impulse to find neat causal explanations for everything.
Right. And he draws a sharp distinction between the way scientific causal explanations work, tracing chains of cause and effect,
Yeah.
often involving specific mechanisms, and the way our aesthetic reactions actually happen. He uses this great example of an architect who builds a door that's too low. You experience this feeling of discomfort when you walk through it, and you're tempted to say, well, the lowness of the door is the cause of my discomfort. Like if we just fix the physical height of the door, the aesthetic problem will be solved. But Wittgenstein argues that this is misapplying a scientific model of causality to a situation where it doesn't really fit.
So we're trying to treat our aesthetic response like it's a simple, measurable effect triggered by a specific cause, like if A, then B.
Exactly. But he says that a genuine aesthetic reaction is much more immediate and entangled with how we perceive and experience the artwork. We don't usually think about our aesthetic responses in terms of causes. He even says in these cases, the word cause is hardly ever used at all. He compares it to like pulling your hand away from a hot stove. It's an immediate, unreflective response.
So it's not like there's this separation between the object, the feeling, and the cause. It's all bound up together.
Precisely. He says to say, I feel discomfort and know the cause is entirely misleading because know the cause normally means something quite different. Like usually when we say we know the cause of something, it implies that there are two separate events. First, the feeling, and then the intellectual act of identifying the cause. But in aesthetics, it's not like that. The experience is much more unified and immediate.
Okay, but doesn't he also acknowledge that we do sometimes ask why when we encounter something aesthetically displeasing?
Yeah, he does. But he's very careful to say that this why isn't a causal why in the scientific sense. It's not like we're looking for some hidden mechanism that's producing the feeling. The kind of answer we're looking for and even what the question itself means depends entirely on the specific context. And this is where there's a real conceptual gap between aesthetics and the methods of empirical psychology.
So trying to study aesthetic responses through experiments and statistics isn't going to get us very far.
Exactly. Because what's really puzzling us about aesthetic experiences is not some hidden causal mechanism. It's about the meaning of our aesthetic language and how it connects to our experience. He writes in Philosophical Investigations, the existence of the experimental method makes us think we have the means of solving the problems which trouble us, though problem and method pass one another by. And he's very clear that aesthetic questions have nothing to do with psychological experiments, but are answered in an entirely different way.
So we can't just reduce aesthetics to a kind of stimulus response model.
Exactly. That kind of reductionism just misses the complexity and nuance of our actual aesthetic engagement. For Wittgenstein, that complexity isn't something to be eliminated. It's the very ground from which genuine understanding can emerge.
Okay, so speaking of complexity, he also talks about the click of coherence in aesthetic satisfaction. Can you unpack that metaphor a bit?
Sure. I think he's trying to capture that feeling of rightness, when everything in a work of art seems to fall into place and make sense, when it achieves a kind of internal harmony. But he contrasts this with the kind of clicking we might experience in, say, a scientific experiment, where we can define very clearly in advance what the conditions for success are. Like, when you're getting an eye exam and the little pointers line up just right. In aesthetics, he says, really, there is nothing that clicks or that fits anything in that same predetermined way.
So aesthetic satisfaction is more immediate and holistic. It's not about fulfilling some preset list of criteria.
Right. And it's also much richer and more expansive than any simple mechanistic account could capture. Now, there might be some very specific cases within a work where we have clear expectations based on rules, like in music, you might anticipate a particular chord progression. But those moments don't account for the overall sense of aesthetic satisfaction we might get from the whole piece.
It's not like checking things off a list.
Precisely. And the kind of explanation we're looking for when we're puzzled by an aesthetic experience, like, why do these particular bars in this piece of music give me such a peculiar feeling? That's not going to be answered by some scientific study that measures people's reactions. He says, the sort of explanation one is looking for when one is puzzled by an aesthetic impression is not a causal explanation.
So imposing a scientific model on aesthetics just distorts the whole nature of the experience.
Absolutely. And he then goes on to talk about what he calls the charm of reduction, particularly in the context of psychoanalytic explanations. He sees a real allure in these kinds of reductive accounts because they promise to give us these really neat and simple explanations for things that often feel very mysterious and complex.
It's like that classic, this is only really this kind of explanation.
Exactly. He uses this really striking example. Imagine taking a complex person, like, say, Redpath, and reducing him to a pile of ashes, and then saying, this is all Redpath really is. Now, in a very literal sense, that's true, but it obviously misses the whole point of what it means to be a person. And he argues that reductive explanations in aesthetics do something similar. They try to explain the whole richness of our experience in terms of some underlying psychological cause or drive.
So instead of appreciating the artwork for what it is, we're just trying to diagnose the viewer.
Right. And this links back to something you talked about earlier in the Blue and Brown books about this craving for generality and this contemptuous attitude toward the particular case. Like the success of science, especially something like Newtonian physics, makes us think we can find a similar kind of mechanics of the soul, that we can reduce the human experience to some set of predictable laws. But Wittgenstein is saying that aesthetic puzzlement is a different kind of problem altogether.
So what are we looking for then when we're trying to understand an aesthetic experience?
He says, what we really want to solve aesthetic puzzlements is certain comparisons grouping together of certain cases. In other words, he's emphasizing the importance of careful, nuanced comparison and a real attention to the specifics of the case at hand.
So instead of trying to find some grand unifying theory, we should be paying attention to the details and looking for connections between different experiences.
Exactly. And this process of comparison, he thinks, is really crucial for highlighting important features, for seeing how styles evolve over time, and for recognizing the uniqueness of individual works. It shifts our focus away from just the effect of the artwork on the viewer and back to the artwork itself.
He also talks about the role of critical reasoning. And he uses that example of hearing a minuet and having a really powerful experience one time, but then hearing it again and feeling nothing.
Right, and this just shows how our aesthetic judgments can be so variable and context-dependent. But he cautions against jumping to the conclusion that what we get out of the minuet is somehow entirely separate from the minuet itself. He thinks that would be to fall into a kind of Cartesian dualism, a sharp separation between mind and matter.
So it's not like the artwork is just a neutral container for our own pre-existing ideas or feelings.
Exactly. That kind of dualism leads to all sorts of problems in thinking about aesthetics. It makes us think of criticism as just a matter of inferring hidden meanings, and creation as just finding external forms for our inner thoughts. And it makes us think of artistic intention as this fully formed blueprint that exists before the work is even made. It's the same mistake we make with language when we think that meaning is just some ethereal thing that accompanies the words, and that the specific words we choose don't really matter.
So it leads to a kind of disregard for the particularity of the work itself.
Precisely. And he makes this really interesting connection between aesthetics and meaning. The sense of a proposition is very similar to the business of an appreciation art, he says. And then he uses this thought experiment. Imagine someone singing a song with expression and then without expression. He asks, then why not leave out the song? Could you have the expression then? And the point is, the expression isn't some separate thing that can be detached from the specific way it's expressed.
So the artwork itself is not just a means to an end, it's an integral part of the experience.
Right, and this leads him to emphasize the importance of seeing connections in understanding art. He's fascinated by how we make connections between different styles, between recurring themes, between different ways of depicting things. He calls this connective analysis, and he thinks it's absolutely essential to how we experience and think about art, something that those reductive causal explanations completely miss.
So it's more about building a network of associations and understandings than it is about identifying isolated causes and effects.
Exactly. And he points out how limited language is when it comes to describing feelings. He asks, could you describe someone's feelings better than by imitating the sounds which he makes when he has them? And the point is, trying to describe feelings without the specific way they're expressed just loses something essential. So these connections we make aren't just simple associations. They're much more complex and nuanced. He talks about a web of variously activated relations between aspects of the work, other works, artists, genres, and even our own experiences.
So it's not just, oh, this reminds me of that. It's something much deeper and richer.
Right. And he's very clear that these connections aren't arbitrary. You can't just swap one thing for another and say it's the same. He says, suppose someone says, associations are what matter, change it slightly, and it no longer has the same associations. But can you separate the associations from the picture and have the same thing? And the answer is no. You can't just say that's just as good as the other. It gives me the same associations. The specific details matter.
He uses that really poignant example of choosing a poem for a bereaved friend. The fact that the poem is about death isn't enough. The specific way it deals with death, the language, the imagery, all of that matters.
Precisely. And this all ties back to his general approach to philosophy. He famously said, if someone talks bosh, imagine the case in which it is not bosh. The moment you imagine it, you see it once. It is not like that in our case. In other words, don't get stuck in abstract generalizations. Always bring it back to concrete examples. And he then briefly talks about the role of our attitude towards the work of art. He uses the example of a monk's smile and how just a slight change in the way the smile is depicted can completely change our attitude towards the image.
So, like, it could go from seeming kindly and benevolent to seeming ironic or even sinister.
Exactly. And how that change in the image can even change our whole stance as viewers from, say, reverence to amusement or even skepticism. And of course, someone might say, well, there you have it. It's all just about the attitude of the viewer.
So it's all subjective.
Right. But Wittgenstein cautions against this oversimplification. He says that focusing only on the viewer's attitude is just another form of that reductive impulse we've been talking about. The description of an attitude is itself a complex thing, and aesthetic experience is something that happens to complex human beings, not just to machines reacting to stimuli.
So we can't just isolate the viewer from the artwork and treat them as separate entities.
Exactly. And then he concludes these lectures by reflecting on this craving for simplicity that he sees in a lot of philosophy, this desire to find some single unifying essence underlying complex phenomena.
It's like we're always searching for the one simple answer that will explain everything.
Right. And he draws a parallel to Bertrand Russell's search for the essence of logical language. He even admits that his own early work, the Tractatus, was influenced by this desire for simplification. But he says that his later work, including these lectures, represents a real shift away from those kinds of reductive models. He emphasizes the crucial role of examples in his later philosophy. They're not just illustrations, they're doing real philosophical work. His goal, he says, is to teach us a new way of thinking about these things.
So we've come full circle back to that opening statement. Aesthetics is very big and entirely misunderstood. Hopefully this deep dive has given us a better sense of what he meant by that.
Absolutely.
Very big.
In the sense that it's so deeply intertwined with our experience of the world, with our language, with our values. It touches on all the biggest questions in philosophy, and entirely misunderstood because we so often try to force it into these reductive models, whether it's essentialism or scientism, that just miss its true complexity and richness.
And the way he uses examples is so important. He's constantly trying to shake us out of our comfortable, abstract generalizations and get us to look at the details, at the specific cases.
Exactly. His goal wasn't to build another grand theory of aesthetics, but to help us see things in a new way, to clear away some of the conceptual confusion that surrounds these issues. And so, for you, our listener, I'll leave you with this. Think about how Wittgenstein's rejection of essentialism and his emphasis on use and context might challenge not just how we think about aesthetics, but how we think about philosophy in general. What would it mean to take this approach to other big philosophical questions? How might it change the way we understand truth, goodness, or even the very nature of knowledge itself?
It's like he's given us a whole new set of tools, and now it's up to us to figure out how to use them.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very exciting prospect.
It certainly is. Well, on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Wittgenstein's aesthetics. It's been, well, a lot to think about.
It always is with Wittgenstein.
Until next time.
See you then.